I thought for sure that Paula was going to take care of that reading from the gospel lesson today and talk about cut off hands and plucked out eyes so that I wouldn't have to mention it. But it clearly is the elephant in the room, so I probably should talk about it. But I think I'll wait for about another 3 years until I preach on it. I will say this about that particular reading. It is very bizarre, very difficult, but what it's really calling for us to do is to take seriously the call of discipleship. Take seriously the call of discipleship. And probably what we have there in Mark is a collection of sayings that he's using, quoting from some other kind of source. You know, he probably had an English professor who said you have to have so many quotes in your paper, and so he pulled all those, and a lot of them don't feel like they fit together and probably don't, and they're probably borrowed from another source. So, but in 3 years, we will go down that path real clearly. I've always been, however, a fan of the wilderness narratives in the Bible. They are so full of hyperbole, so full of exaggeration, and in my opinion, therefore, they're quite funny. They're so real. While they may not necessarily be historical, they are so very true. For many of us, wilderness is a great metaphor for where we often find ourselves. Terry Fredheim says that the wilderness is a buffer between liberation and landedness. A crossover point, a threshold, where you hang out after you have been set free, but you haven't fully arrived in the promised land. Jesus was baptized and was given an identity, was named Son of God, and then, so says Mark, he was cast out into the wilderness, and for 40 days and 40 nights he stayed there, and after that threshold, after that buffer, he began his ministry, found his place, even if that place was always changing and a matter of great challenge. The Old Testament tells us the story of the people of Israel being set free, being liberated from the hands of the Egyptians. Yet they don't go from Egypt to the promised land. They roam in the wilderness for 40 years. And as I have pointed out before, some people think that men must have been leading this group because it took them 40 years to go through the wilderness. Somebody's not stopping and asking for direction. That shouldn't have taken that long. But again, remember this is not history, this is metaphor. This is the way life is. You and I spend a lot of time in the wilderness, sometimes roaming around, often not asking for directions. And if I can be honest, sometimes it feels like we spend much of our lives in the wilderness. Occasionally, I feel like I'm about ready to move into the promised land, and boom, I'm taken right back into the wilderness. I relate to Moses sometimes. You know, he's taken to the edge of the promised land, then God says you can't go in. This is metaphor, folks. This is how life really is sometimes. And for me personally, I have to tell you, lately, with one death after another, I have never had 5 funerals in 1 week, but this is what I have this coming week. 5 funerals, one death after another, and all kinds of sickness, serious sickness. The wilderness for me is not simply metaphor, it's real history. And I don't want to be morbid, but sometimes I wonder if the wilderness is not reality. The book of Numbers, literally in the Hebrew, in the wilderness, gives us the majority of the biblical wilderness stories. And today we get one of the complaining stories. We are told that a rabble among them, this could be some outsiders, had a strong craving, and the Israelites were weeping because they didn't like their food choices. Oh, if we only had meat to eat. Oh, if we only had some fish, some cucumbers, some melons, some leeks, some onion, and who could forget some great garlic? I have to say, I have never heard people longing for leeks, even though I like leeks, but it's never been on the top 10 list of food, I think, for most people. But for them, if we could just go back to Egypt, let's go back to Egypt. In fact, let's appoint a committee. We'll call it the Go Back to Egypt Committee. This is one of the real challenges of being in the wilderness. You begin to think that it was a lot better in the past, even if the past included slavery. And I hear us, and I hear me saying this once in a while, the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or whatever decade you want to go back to. They were so much better. Let's go back to them. Let's form a Go Back to the 70s committee. Now, personally, I think that's not so bad. I would like a return of disco because I think disco got some bad press. I would not mind a little more Night Fever, Night Fever. I was such good music. I love it. But I got to be honest, bring me the disco back, but forget the leisure suits. I had one of them. That was ugly. This is one of the temptations of the wilderness, the temptation to go back. It's where a lot of people spend their time and energy when they're in the wilderness. But there's no going back, folks. The wilderness is preparing us for a new future. But when you are in the midst of the wilderness, that future feels far, far away. The familiar orderliness of the past seems preferable, as Fredheim puts it, to the insecurities of life lived from one oasis to another. The wilderness feels quite insecure, and sometimes it feels downright oppressive, which is why we complain a lot when we're there, why we cry profusely. The food doesn't taste all that good, and it's not filling, and honestly, as mean as those Egyptians were, at least they gave us a little meat. Once in a while, a nice little piece of salmon would be good, and we're supposed to be happy with manna? Yuck! Complaining, lamenting, they're part of the process when you're in the wilderness. It's just what you do sometimes. And at times, it's a matter of just telling the truth. You don't like where you are. And at other times, it sure sounds like a lack of gratitude. I don't know for sure, but maybe that is why God is ticked off today and Moses is displeased. Maybe they're upset about lack of gratitude. Don't know for sure. Numbers tells us Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families because of the food situation, all at the entrance of their tents. In other words, at the place where everybody else can hear them. And God becomes very angry at this point. And Moses becomes extremely displeased. And so displeased that Moses speaks directly to God and says this, "Why have you treated me so badly? Why don't you like me anymore? What have I done to you that you would put all this burden on me? Give me this nasty, whining bunch of Israelites. I did not give birth to these people. You did. And you want me to care for them as a nurse does for a suckling child? How am I supposed to get meat for all these people? Tell me. I can't handle all of this on my own." Whoa. Moses is quite honest here. He's not afraid to ask God to be accountable. He's even willing to be a little needy. He, the leader of the people, is willing to identify his limits. How is he supposed to manage this whole people? Here's what you are free to do in the wilderness. You are free to tell the truth. While neediness often doesn't look good on you, sometimes you can even be a little needy and maybe even a little ungrateful. And you can identify your limits. It's not all up to you. Now, I got to tell you, because my wife will tell you this, I'm not very good at that. I suspect that for my own personal identity, my identity has been wrapped up with pushing the limits. I've participated in a sport, triathlon, that is all about pushing your body to limits that you couldn't imagine you could meet. I came from a very conservative, blue-collar family in Cincinnati that valued work. And I probably have given myself points for working harder than just about everybody else. And my wife has frequently told me that I need to let go of things that other folks could do. And knowing that she probably wouldn't get very far with that particular argument, she would say something like this. She would tell me that folks in the future aren't going to do what you do. Well, and she's probably right, but she probably ought to keep telling me I can recognize my limits too. We are free, as Moses did, to struggle with God. In the wilderness, the relationship is not simply about smiling and nodding. In their wilderness, there is the freedom to wrestle with God, to ask God the hard questions, to lay it on the line with God. In case you don't know it, the name Israel, you know what it means? The people who struggle with God. The whole of the Old Testament is about a people who struggle with God. Much of contemporary Christianity, especially that which you experience in the media, doesn't name that struggle. It tells you that life is all clear. All you need are a few Bible verses and a few prayers, and in God all the problems are resolved. And in this view of faith, faith is not about questions but about answers. I think I surprised some folks this past Sunday at a memorial service that I was doing when I said, sometimes life stinks. And this is one of the sometimes. Faith is not about resolving the struggle. Faith is about entering into it. And as Paula and I have told you so many times before, entering the struggle is not something we do alone. When you are in the wilderness, you have to get this. You do have limits, and other people are there to help out. So Moses gathered 70 elders of the people and placed them all around the tent. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and spoke to him and took some of the Spirit that was on him and put it on the 70 elders. And when the Spirit rested upon them, they ended up doing some of the speaking, ended up doing some of the work. You're right, Moses. You can't do it alone. You need help. That's why I got 70 folks here for you. Life lived best is life lived in community. Life lived best is not life lived independently, focused only on you and your ability to manage the struggles of the wilderness. We are in the wilderness together. And what that wilderness looks like may challenge you sometimes. What that togetherness looks like may challenge you sometimes. Eldad and Medad, my next two kids, I'm going to name them that. Eldad and Medad, who don't follow the right procedures, might be those who are there to help you. Some who are not a part of your group, but who are still doing the work of Jesus, might be the ones to bring you a cup of cold water. Truthfully, in the wilderness, the labels we give to people aren't helpful. When you are in the wilderness, whether people are in your club, have your label, agree with you on everything, really doesn't matter. When you are going in for brain surgery, whether your brain surgeon is Lutheran, Pentecostal, Muslim, or Jewish, isn't going to mean much to you. You want to know that she knows what she's doing, that she can be of help to you. Those who aren't against us are for us. In the wilderness, there's plenty of room for all kinds of people. In the wilderness, the struggle is too intense and too real for us to resort to dividing people into us and them. In the wilderness, we're all in this together. The wilderness is real. It's where we spend much of our time. Yeah, I know the Israelites eventually moved from the wilderness into the promised land, and I know that Jesus' death gave way to resurrection, and it's worth our while to keep that truth in the forefront of our minds. But sometimes, if we're honest, we'll admit we sure spent a lot of time in the wilderness. Know this: as Moses, Israel, and even Jesus discovered, while the wilderness is a hard place, it is not a God-abandoned place. Yes, it's a place for struggle, but the struggle is with God, the God who set you free, and the God who one day will bring you home.